Hey everybody, and welcome to Epic Every Day, our weekday podcast for busy, stressed out Christians who want to find freedom, abundance, and peace. I'm Liz Frericks, and this is my husband, Evan.
Hi.
And we're so glad you guys are here with us today on this wonderful Thursday.
Yeah, the week's just charging by, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
Thank you for spending part of it with us. We really appreciate that. If you found this episode helpful or interesting, please share it with a friend. Maybe see what they think about it.
Today's CSC is being connected, which is primarily our connection to God, because that's where our power comes from, but also our connection to other people. And this week, we are talking about ministry and how God's called us all to be lights in the darkness. This isn't just for leaders or pastors, like everybody's called to this.
Yeah, every Christian. Yeah, and we're definitely going to get into that importance, how our connection with God makes it even possible to be connected to another person.
We live in a world of suffering. I mean, it's just a fact of life.
And being engaged in ministry is going to open up the door to even more suffering. Your own suffering and just seeing those that you're ministering to, you're going to see and be participating in their suffering too. It's going to
right. Well, and as you love other people, as you fight for them in prayer and things like that, you become more and more invested in their lives, and so their suffering reaches you on deeper and deeper levels.
Yeah.
That's kind of the point of having friends. They touch your heart.
Yeah, but if we get bogged down with that and kind of swept away with the suffering, that leads to bitterness, isolation, and jadedness.
Right, and I think if you look at our culture, that's so the way things are.
Yeah.
I mean, the isolation thing, everyone is so isolated. Isolation is more of a problem today than it ever has been, despite the fact that we are theoretically more connected than we ever have been.
Yeah, connected electronically, but not actually personally.
Right. Yeah. It's so interesting how that works, how we need that face-to-face. There's just something about looking in somebody's eyes and having a conversation with them that's important.
Yeah, and there's all these degrees. I mean, just in our own lives, just realizing that sometimes it's easier to text than to make the phone call even. You're not even looking at the person, and you're still going to, be a little bit more withdrawn. We're not even, hearing each other. So it's definitely a struggle.
It is. And it's easy to put up walls when you're suffering. And it's easy to put up walls around other people's suffering too. I mean, it's overwhelming when you're just reading the newspaper or watching the news and seeing, all the suffering worldwide. Because there's awful stuff happening somewhere in the world every single minute.
Mm-hmm. So the light into that darkness then is going to be true connection, contentment, and tenderness. Those are going to be the things we're striving for, but how do we get those things? Right.
Well, and I think the connection piece, suffering either isolates us or connects us. Our suffering can drive us to say, God, I need you. I need your work in my life. Or it can drive us to say, I don't want anything to do with you,
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about Mary and Martha when we were thinking about this. So we first meet Mary and Martha in Luke 10. I'm going to start in verse 38. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. And that's kind of the quintessential story to talk about how busyness keeps us from sitting at Jesus's feet.
Mm-hmm.
But so here she has Jesus there, but instead of connecting with him, she's completely focused on trying to get stuff done, which I'm sure it was stuff that needed to get done, like cooking and things that need to be done for hospitality's sake. But she's still focused on that instead of Jesus. Whereas in John 11, her brother dies, and when he's sick, they send for Jesus, and he doesn't come. And then 3 days later, he does finally come. And I'm going to start in verse 20. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. And I just love this because, yes, it's horrible that her brother is dead. But that suffering causes her to connect with Jesus in such a powerful way. I mean, his statement, I am the resurrection and the life, that's like one that everybody quotes. And it doesn't come from him just like teaching on a hillside, which there are plenty of great statements that come from him teaching on a hillside. But this is an individual statement made to someone who is in crisis. So he's ministering to her while she's in the middle of suffering. And it's her suffering that drives her to come to him. Mm-hmm. Even though before, she's just busy and kind of focused on the other stuff that's going on.
Yeah, you can kind of see, I was thinking about now the difference between jaded and tenderness. Like in the first story, she's bitter and she's like, Jesus, you got to sort this out. This is a big problem. And here she has a grievance again with Jesus, but it's more of just submission and I don't know. She's more brokenhearted and more receptive to Jesus' gentleness, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to me because I felt that in my own life where suffering becomes a bridge. Anybody that I've talked to that's like, oh, I have a trauma background too. It's like an instant connection, and you can connect with somebody like that in a way that I can't connect with people who don't have a trauma background just because they don't understand what it's like. And I think all of our sufferings can be that way. We can both, draw closer to God because we need him to get us through it. He's the only one that can rescue us, just like Martha's saying, like, nobody else can take care of this problem but you.
Yeah.
Right. But we can also draw closer to other people. We can minister more effectively. We can shine our light in the darkness by being open about the things that we have suffered and by sitting with people in the middle of their sufferings.
Yeah. I think one thing that we'll find, though, and this makes things makes ministry more difficult, is when we are drawing closer to people, we're closer, and that's good, but we're also exposing ourselves to more suffering.
Yeah.
We have our own now, and now we're aware of theirs, and we care about it, and it weighs more heavy on our heart. And so the way to shine light into all this has to start with our connection with God, casting our cares on him, our own cares, and now the cares of the people that we love, and having that make sense of the suffering.
Right, because if we aren't connected to God, if we don't have a God who, like we've talked about in Romans 8:28, where it says that God works all things together for the good of those who love him. If that isn't our God, we have every reason to be bitter. There's no way to find contentment because we live in a broken world. Life is hard, and we need God to bring redemption out of that and to make us able to be content because it's hard. And we need our connection with God and who he is in order to not be jaded. Because it's too easy, especially with our, I don't know what you call it, just the overconsumption of media, where we just kind of get deadened. I was thinking about this. The other day we watched Fifth Element, and one of the main characters, the Fifth Element girl, like she just is blown away by how much destruction mankind brings. And I was thinking about that, like what if every death that I saw in a movie or on TV in the news or whatever hit me that way. I mean, I couldn't handle it, I'd be overloaded all the time because there's so much real violence and there's so much, cinema violence. The combination would just
right.
be crazy.
Well, and we need to be sensitive to it, like to be a real human being.
Right.
We're desensitized. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Like, it's not as big of a deal as it should be. Right.
Yeah, we want to not be jaded. We want to not be like, oh, and there's another homeless person or whatever. We want to have hearts that are soft, that are like God's, that are able to break over those things. But it's hard. And if we don't have our connection with God, our assurance that he's working everything out for good, I don't think there's any way to be tenderhearted.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of two other extremes, and I'm not sure. Let's see if this makes any sense. This idea of contentment too being so important, to combating bitterness. Again, I'm trying to. So you've got the people who preach that you can have everything you want if you just have the right kind of faith, and so you're not content with the bounty because life itself is bountiful. The ability to breathe, the living and being, that's a certain kind of richness. But then we have teachers who say, well, you're entitled to even more, and this kind of richness that you can define yourself.
Right.
But then you also have discontentment on the other end of people who don't preach grace enough, and they're obsessed with sin and damnation and just preaching against all the bad stuff the world's doing without a lot of tenderness, like we're talking about. And so an effective and a good minister is going to not get sucked into either of those extremes and to, try to live in the real world with people,
Right.
Some people have access to a lot of resources and some people don't. And there's this tension of wanting to be content with that, but also wanting to grow and maybe, maybe it's right to try to make more money and to support your kids in a different way or whatever. But that doesn't mean our goal is to become a billionaire.
Right, yeah. Well, it's like Jesus says in Matthew that we seek God and his kingdom first, and then he takes care of the rest.
And see what happens. Yeah. Whenever we try to say, well, this is obviously God's way of doing things is this, holy poverty, or no, it's this, it's health and wellness. It's like, well, let's just focus on God. And
yeah, I mean, that goes back to what we're talking about today, connection. If we have our connection with God right, the rest of it sorts itself out.
See what your life will look like. But while it's connected to God, that's where we're supposed to be.
Right. And that is what being a light looks like. And that's what every single Christian is called to be a light. Not just the pastors.
Yeah. And we're
all ministers.
Right. And it touches suffering in this way, I guess. If we're ministering to someone who's suffering, or even if we're looking at ourselves, we don't want to get sucked into the trap of minimizing it and be like, it's not a big deal, or getting so consumed by it that it's like, oh, you're right. It's just the world is the worst, and despair or disregard, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. We want to walk that line between those. We want to stay connected to God and love others and love ourselves, like we talked about yesterday.
Yeah.
As always, pick whether today is going to be awesome or not, whether you're going to strengthen those neural pathways to look for the good things or the not so good things. We love you guys, and we are praying for you. Thanks to everybody that's been listening to the show and sharing the show. We really appreciate it. If you have found this episode helpful, please do share it. And come back tomorrow, and we are going to talk about...
We're talking about entering into other people's darkness, so maybe that's kind of where I was headed.
Yeah.
We'll flesh that out a little bit more tomorrow.
Sounds good. All right, you guys, have a great Thursday.
See you later.